It looks like that's everybody in. So good evening, everybody, and a very happy new year. Let's hope 2022 is a great year for biodiversity, particularly with COP15. Let's hope we can make some changes. Tonight, we've got Emily Millhouse, who is doing the final in our series of webinars. But we will be having another series later in the year, but we will give it a bit of a break. Emily joined Froglife in 2016 to work on our London Dragon Finder project, and has since then been working on our London T.O.A.D project as our very knowledgeable project manager. Emily is passionate about connecting people to nature, particularly in urban environments. Emily has done an amazing job on connecting a wide range of London communities to their local green spaces, and is well versed on delivering this presentation on amphibian ID and ecology. Take the floor, Emily.
Thank you very much, Kathy. I'm just going to share my screen. Just give me a moment. And then I'm hoping everybody now should be able to see my screen. Ash, could you just let me know?
Yeah, I can see it.
That's perfect. Well, yeah, thank you. Reiterating what Kathy said there, thank you very much for joining us this evening. I personally don't see what's better to do in the new year than talk about toads and their friends. But yeah, thank you for joining us in that passion. So tonight we're going to do a short introduction to amphibian identification and ecology for here in the UK. I'll try my best to get through all of our species and dip into a few other topics as I do so. But I figured to begin, I know not all of us here are already Froglife friends, so you may have only heard of us from this, from the advertisements of this. So just to give you a short introduction about us. So Froglife, we're a national wildlife conservation charity committed to conserving amphibians and reptiles and their habitats. So we do this in three main ways, really. The first one, which is probably the real obvious one to a lot of people, in the transforming landscape. So we spend a lot of time out there creating new habitats, so creating ponds or restoring ponds, and also working a lot on terrestrial habitat or land habitats for our reptile species. You'll also find us in a broad range of places, working with people to do this. So a key part of this, like having webinars like this, going into schools, even going into prisons. We try our best to work with as many people as possible to raise the profile really of our amphibians and reptiles in the UK, as they're quite often overshadowed by the fluffy species or the species with wings, sadly. And the third and final part of our work is looking into transforming research. So lots of this is covering working on things like our Toads on Roads project, which has led to papers being written looking at mitigation for toads and other amphibian species and crossing roads. So we have a large wildlife tunnel campaign that I'll talk about a little bit more later on, and also working with international partners in looking into things like amphibian and reptile disease, because sadly there's quite a lot that affects our species groups. The second bullet point there, Froglife Ecological Services, that's for any landowner really. They can get in touch with us and you can get involved with us to come along and either do surveys on your behalf or any habitat works or training courses. That's a very brief introduction to us, but I shall now introduce what we're all here for, the lovely amphibians. So, Amphibian ID. We have our 7 native British amphibians, and just to clarify what I'm meaning by native British here, that's anything post the last sort of ice age really, that was here in the UK, sort of in the British Isles really. That's what we're looking at when I'm talking about these 7 species. So to begin, just at the top, we have our anurans, or our frogs and toads. So we have our common frog in the top left, we have our common toad in the middle, and we have the Natterjack toad in the top right. We also have our salamanders or newt species here. So on the bottom left, we have our smooth newt. In the middle, we have our palmate newt, and on the right-hand side, we have our great crested newt. Now, I've not gone crazy post dinner time and not lost the ability to count. The last species here gets its own smooth transition into our slide. The lovely pool frog, and the reason why that gets its own transition is it was a species that had gone extinct here in the UK many years ago, but there's been quite a successful reintroduction programme. So in places like northern parts of Norfolk and a few other patches around the UK, you can now see them back out in the wild. So that's something quite exciting that you can go out. If I inspire you to go and tick off your UK herp list this evening, it's one of the species you can go out and have a little look for. But we will begin with our namesake for our charity, Froglife. So we've got the lovely common frog. So what is it when we think frogs, really, when it comes to amphibians? We think of their lovely smooth skin. So if I draw your attention particularly to this frog here that's on sort of a log or on land, we can see it's got quite a glossy skin. So you're looking at that kind of shine, and it's quite a damp look really. And that's something that's indicative of looking at a frog. So if we're seeing that smooth and shiny skin, then we definitely know it's a frog that we're looking at and not a toad when you're out and about within your gardens. The other thing, if I draw their attention to their face here, and it's something that we use quite a lot when we teach within schools actually, the kids call it the superhero mask. If you can see this dark eye patch just behind the eye, so you can see it here on the green coloured frog, and you can see it here on the brown coloured frog. That dark eye patch is something that you'll only spot on the common frog species. So very, very handy for us coming up to this season, where of course all of our frogs and other amphibians are heading to the ponds, is of course when that frog is within the pond, you're only going to see the top half of their head. So if you can already see that they've got an eye mask behind that eye, then you can be pretty confident that it is a common frog that you're spotting. The other thing with that, and it's just to draw attention a little bit with sort of their facial shape or their body shape, and also to arm you all with a load of pub facts for later on, is that when you look at the amphibians' eyes and the way that they're placed, not only are they placed higher than the actual head itself, so of course, for an animal that spends itself partially underneath water and the top half on top, those eyes are positioned there to not only look for predators, but also make it easier for them to be able to swallow food. So unlike us with our muscles here within our throats, frogs don't necessarily have that kind of muscle mass there. They have their vocal sac in that kind of position. So if you often go next to a pond and you see a frog consistently blinking, it may be they've just eaten something and they're swallowing that food down. So it's another good use for their eyes and the shape of their body being based like this. The final key thing that we look at when we try and identify a frog is we look at these sort of striped back legs. So again, I'll draw your attention to this frog just on the right hand side. We can see these very long sort of double folded over back legs here with these stripes on them. Again, within schools, they tend to call it go faster stripes, because if it's an animal you disturb within your veg patch and it quickly moves away, hops, leaps and sprints away from you with huge bounding movements, it's pretty fast, then you can be sure it's a frog that you found rather than a toad. So that's something to look out for. If you see in those stripy back legs, then it is a frog definitely. And that's something you can carry on outside of the UK. So if you go within sort of mainland Europe, you'll find that most frog species there that you'll find anywhere around will have striped back legs. There are a few exemptions to that rule, of course. A few of our tree frogs and things like that don't have back legs or their body shape quite like this, but it's a really good base to begin with. So I'm hoping everybody here has their sound nice and high, and if there's anyone watching TV in the room with you, they're going to get a shock because my voice will disappear. We're just going to have a little listen to the call of the common frog, because as much as all of our textbooks as children tell us that frogs go ribbit, there's a very, very small proportion of frogs in the world that do go ribbit. So here we go. So it's almost closer to a cat's purr, what we're listening to. And this can get to quite a chorus. So we're in the perfect time of year for you to go out frog spotting. As they start to move towards their ponds and you get lots and lots of males together, all making these calls, it can be quite a boom that you're hearing within the ponds at this time of year. Fun fact for you, the reason why we do think that ribbit is the noise that all frogs make is because there are frog species in Los Angeles, very, very close to Hollywood, that have frogs that do go ribbit there. So naturally the sound, they've evolved from there into sort of media, and that's the kind of sounds that we're now associating with frogs. But it is fascinating. If there's something else you can go away and look after, I'm going to give you a long list of things to go and find after this talk, is to go and listen to all different frog calls from around the world. I mean, you can see it here. We've got two different coloured frogs, but it goes further than that. We can get frogs in all different shades and markings. So we can see here, top left, you've got the more traditional green coloured frog. So the one below, that's a little bit more grayer in colour. And then you've got the more reddish coloured frogs on the right-hand side. Now, some of you that might be a little bit better versed in amphibians, and particularly amphibian disease, may be alarmed by looking at any frog that's got any red on them. But I will touch upon sort of any diseases that are associated with the colour red on some of our amphibians later on within this talk. But the key things from this slide I really want to show you is that from anywhere where you'll find our frogs, whether they're green you still have that dark eye mask. So on all of the colour frogs here, you can see it's visibly darker than the rest of the coloration of their skin, and also these striped back legs you'll still find. Now, if you're particularly keen, you have a large frog population in your back garden, you can actually take photos of frogs' backs year on year, and you'll see if it's the same individuals coming back to your pond and your back garden every single year. It's a fascinating thing to see, and as they grow up, those back patterns stay the same. So they may get slightly bigger if the frog itself gets larger in size, but it's a fascinating thing to be able to watch. Now, I love the fact that everybody's muted, because I can say the next statement with pure confidence. The next animal is the best animal in all of the UK. It is a very, very handsome common toad. And there's many, many reasons why this animal is wonderful. One, it's an animal that often doesn't get a lot of press or positivity. It can sometimes be associated with folklore, and I think even that's quite special. The whole reason that it was chosen in many senses to be associated with witches and witchcraft was because of the way it looked. People thought it was quite mysterious. It moves around, generally in moonlight. It spends its time in the undergrowth. And they thought, instead of saying, hey, I'm just adding a bit of carrot or something to this dish, let's say it's something from the toad's body and no one will steal my recipe. So I think they're quite a special animal for us here in the UK. But when looking at their sort of ID features and what we think about when we look at toads, they have this sort of very rough, warty skin. So you can see it on all three pictures we've got here. Actually, particularly this photo here, you can see from their back. The coloration of toads generally doesn't vary too much. We go from kind of brick red through to the sort of browns or quite dark greens when we're looking at our common toads. So that's something to be looking out for. You can also say, actually, even from when they're within water, they still look quite dry in appearance compared to that glossy sheen that we got on our common frog. So that's something to look out for within the pond itself. The other thing to draw your attention to is their hind legs. So again, this top right photo here, you can spot they've got very, very small sort of stumpy back legs that aren't very muscular. So quite different to our common frog that we just looked at. And there's a good reason for this. So toads have sort of evolved in a sense, or made a decision basically as they have evolved, that that's not going to be their main predatory, the main reaction to get away from predators. So whereas our frog, when startled, first thing it does is leap out the way, move very, very quickly. Toads don't do that. They've invested more into developing these glands. So I'm hoping you can see my cursor. Otherwise, I'm saying this and pointing and no one can see it. But there should be two very, very large bumps just behind the eyes of the toad, and these are called its parotoid glands. And these glands create a bufotoxin. So to us, it would be a very sort of foul-tasting liquid, and they secrete this all over their backs. Now, of course, this is perfect to stop yourself being eaten from anything like a badger or a fox, because you just taste really, really bad and you need to get spit out. But not great for our toads when it comes to things that involve us, really, as humans. One of their big issues here within the UK is their mortality rates on roads. So when toads see a car coming towards them, when it startles them, the first thing they're going to do, they're going to stay very still. Often they'll flatten themselves out. They'll secrete this liquid over their back, which makes them taste bad and makes them incredibly vulnerable to any vehicles coming towards them. I will add, as a caveat to that, just because before any of you go out and getting any ideas, common toads in the UK, their toxin doesn't give you any hallucinogenic effects, and any toad patroller that might have handled a toad and then forgotten to wash their hands before eating a sandwich may be aware they taste very, very similar to sort of acetone or like nail polish remover. So that's what they're producing over their backs to stop things from eating them. I'll get all the negative stats out of the way in this presentation, although a very, very important thing to talk about with our amphibians. I'll try and get them out of the way and we'll get onto the positivity. One thing with this is it is about 20 tonnes of dead common toads each year pulled off of British roads, which is a huge amount that gets squashed out there whilst trying to move back towards their breeding ponds. So it is a very serious issue for us to be looking at. And in the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about how even for where you live, you might be able to get involved to help those toads that are migrating. But going back to some of those features that we're looking for here, one of the key things is they completely lack that eye mask that we were looking at with the frogs. So you can see here, just behind their eyes, there's no definitive marking there or change in coloration. Again, same reason or same thing we were looking at with the frogs. When you're seeing them in springtime, you can only see the top of their head sticking out of the water. If you're not seeing that mask there, you can be fairly confident it's a common toad. We can go deeper into that, and here comes another one of my pop culture references here. You can almost think of common toads as the James Bond of the pond, because common toads will always have a golden coloured iris. So you can see here, if you're seeing that gold colour shining straight back at you and not any other visible colour there, then you can be sure it's a common toad that you've found within that space. So that's another thing to look out for when looking at their faces in that kind of place. When we're looking at kind of sizes for common toads, generally they are about the same size as common frogs when you get down to it. The key difference is actually between the males and females. So this bottom photo is actually showing you them whilst they're breeding, so they're in amplexus here. You can see the male, which is on the female's back, is significantly smaller in the way that she's gripped onto, he's significantly smaller the way that he's gripped onto that female below. And that's something you will spot actually going into sort of March time this year. It's something you'll see more and more, and for any of the toad patrollers joining us this evening, you'll probably see quite a lot over the past few years as you've moved these toads around. It's another fantastic thing about them. But going back to that whole issue on the roads, when we're looking at these declines, it's a pretty high amount, so I'll come back to the sound in a second. But looking at that population decline, and I think anyone that came along to Darren's talk previously, he did mention this, in that our UK common toad populations have declined by 68% over the last 30 years, and the biggest declines of those are in the southeast. So my project here, based in London, is based on common toads, and it is based on trying our best to improve their habitats, or trying to improve places around their sort of main habitats to stop them from entering onto some of the busy roads here in those kind of places. Now, there is absolutely wonderful work that you can do to help out with this. And I'm sure Ash will be putting a link into the chat for people to follow. But you can volunteer with our Toads on Roads project, which has been running now for about 40 years. And we've got about 175 patrol groups that all go out in springtime with their buckets, with their high-vis, and they help these toads get across that road. So it's to stop that mortality event from happening. If we can be there, help move them across and get to their breeding ponds without our other human interaction of cars or anything, then they have a significantly higher chance of being able to successfully breed within that period of time. That's something very much to go out and get involved with. Going back just here to the common toad, I'll let you have a listen to them, because again, some of you might have heard this before, but it's quite a different sound to what we expect from a UK amphibian. So we would call this sound a quark, a very high-pitched quark. And if you were to go walking by a local park in the evening and you're hearing that, you'd be forgiven for thinking it might have been a bird or something like that within the water. But if you're hearing that over and over, that's essentially all the males vocalizing within that pond, just sort of booming, and it's an incredible sound. And even within the most urban of spaces, so I've got a few sites that I visit quite regularly in about zone 2 of London, and you will hear this all throughout spring. It's a fantastic thing to be able to hear. So one of our less common species to find, I briefly mentioned it earlier on, and I won't go into too much detail about the pool frog because its range is quite small here within the UK. So not all of us will be fortunate enough to be able to spot them on our day-to-day. But a key theme I want you to get a little thought about when thinking about our sort of less common amphibian species in the UK is if you ever see a stripe running down the back of our amphibians. So just looking here, we've got this dorsal stripe. If you're ever seeing a bright stripe, whether that be sort of a bright green or a bright yellowish colour, then you know you've actually spotted quite a special amphibian here in the UK. So that's at least one ID feature I want you definitely to take away with you. If you ever spot that, then you know you found something that's a little bit different to normal. So that's one of the key things that we look out for with our pool frogs. Another thing are these ridges down its back. So you can see just here on the edge, we've got these dorsolateral ridges that are quite pronounced on our pool frog. And that's also quite pronounced on many of our traditionally called green frogs, or within Europe, really. If you're seeing that very angular shape, then you know it's not a common frog that you're spotting within sort of a pond or anything like that. The other big difference, and again, we're moving into the perfect season, so it's the perfect time that we're giving this talk right now, is their vocal sacs. So pool frogs have dual vocal sacs, as you can see in this top right photo here, just circled. So they inflate at both sides of their head. So it looks quite interesting, really. these huge, great bubbles almost, it looks like, right at the edge that inflate as they're calling out. And that's very different to both our common toad and our common frog, which only have the single vocal sac, so they'll only ever be inflating here at the bottom. Also quite useful if you're by the pond edge, there's loads and loads of reeds. You can hear a call happening, but you can't see anything. You can actually track what species it is that you might be hearing by looking at the patterns in the water. So the vibrations that are given off by two vocal sacs inflating is a little bit different to a single vocal sac. So you can get your honing skills to find where your amphibian is that's hidden away. So sticking with that theme of our less common anurans that we find out and about, we can look a little bit at the Natterjack toad. So for anyone that might be based in sort of the northern parts of Norfolk, or in some places right down in sort of the southwest, this might be a species that you're familiar with and spotting. It's another one of our toad species. They're a lot less commonly found, and they have quite a specific habitat that they like to live within. So they prefer sort of sand dunes. And actually, I always think it's quite interesting, if you're keen on walking, you do walk any sort of coastal paths, and you ever find, and it looks quite odd, just sort of a pond that's completely fenced in, it's very likely that that pond has been fenced in for a population of Natterjack toads. And that's just to reduce the chances of anything like dogs running into those ponds and disturbing any of their breeding or anything like that. And also just to stop general people's sort of access in and out to disturb them. So it's very likely if you're near any ponds that are fenced in like that, very, very close to the shoreline, you could have a very special species that you can spot there. So same as our common toad, they have a very sort of rough and warty skin. So you can see there, they don't have that sort of glossy shine that we saw on that common frog initially. They're very mottled in colour, but I think actually this bottom left photo explains exactly why they're mottled. In spending so much time in dunes or in those kind of sandy places, it's a good idea to have your camouflage pattern less blocky. It's a good place to be able to hide. And the final part is, again, that same rule of if it's not common in the UK, it tends to have a stripe down its back. So if you're seeing that dorsal stripe, it's quite a bright yellow, especially if you're looking into anywhere where there's slightly more grass. It's a very, very definitive thing that jumps out at you when walking past those places. So yeah. Differences can be found all the way back at the start. So I know some people, if anyone's joining us from the southwest, may be very, very lucky and making the rest of us very envious of them tonight because they may already have frog spawn. We can tell the differences between our frogs and toads even from this stage. So our frogs, they lay these large sort of jelly-like or tapioca-like clumps on the surface of the water, and you can often find these generally around the edges of ponds. And the more and more females that come along is the more and more that will be laid on top. So each clump is generally the product of one female's lay, and she generally will only lay one clump per season. So you can get a really good idea of your population size by counting up the amount of clumps within a space. And to give you an idea of numbers on that, she's probably laying between 2,000 to 3,000 eggs per clump every single year. Now, some females that are a lot larger and a little bit older may lay up to 5,000 eggs. It can be done, but a good sort of perspective on that is you're not going to get a plague of frogs, which is quite sad for people like me, I suppose. I'd love to see a plague of frogs walking across a field, but it's about 0.14% of those eggs there that you can see that will actually make it into an adult breeding frog. So it's a really, really small proportion that make it. And it very much is a numbers game for our frogs. She'll lay that many knowing that most things in that pond, whether it be dragonfly larvae or things like that, will be eating some of those spawn around the edges there. So just to be aware of. I could probably do a whole talk on just the reproductive traits of our amphibians, but I imagine some of you will want to go to bed at some point tonight, so I won't. But there's lots of interesting things as well to look at with spawn and the way that water's circulated around, or how multiple males can fertilize one clump. Many, many interesting things to look at with frog spawn. Moving on to toad spawn, often lesser seen. So we can see here the female lays it in two strings, very, very closely together, and she'll tend to lay that right at the bottom of the pond, and she'll weave in and out of the vegetation, essentially hiding that spawn. So she also can lay up to 2,000 eggs, although generally they tend to be laying closer to about 300 eggs at a time. Now, she doesn't need to worry too much about that numbers game there, as not only is she choosing a less obvious place to hide the spawn, every single little egg there that you can see, so every single dot already has that bufotoxin. So to many things that you could find in that pond, for instance, fish, won't eat that toad spawn at that point because it already tastes foul for them. Whereas fish would gladly consume all of that frog spawn there and much more within that pond. But this is something that's quite a foul taste to them. That difference can continue all the way up to the next stage. So we're looking here at when they're tadpoles. So we have our frog tadpoles here on the left-hand side, but that kind of sort of brown coloration with gold speckles. And this is fantastic for us, particularly if it's a nice sunny day, sort of through April or any time like that. You're looking into the pond, generally in little sort of small groups around the edge of the pond. You'll find this so easily because it will just shimmer off of the sunlight. So it's a nice thing to bounce back off of you to showcase what species it is you have within that pond. So they tend to stay, again, grouped in small numbers around the edge of the ponds. And this is also why it's really, really important, actually, for people not to remove spawn from ponds. So in your local park, even if you want to take some home, it's best to leave it just there, because although those dragonfly larvae would have been feasting on the frog spawn at that stage, the minute those tadpoles become carnivorous, the relationship changes. And all of those now very, very beefy dragonfly larvae, things like that within the pond, the situation changes, and the tadpoles will now start to predate on some of those when they start to eat meat. So it's really important for us to keep a good balance of some of the animals we have within the pond. Toad tadpoles, again, I'm very biased, are even cooler than frog tadpoles. They're almost jet black in appearance. They tend to be quite bulky in sort of their head shape. Something as well that they do that's pretty interesting, and is not something people think about our very small animals doing within the ponds, is they move in big shoals. So you can get a few thousand toad tadpoles all grouped together, and they'll move within the water, almost like if you imagine sort of starlings doing a murmuration in the sky. They basically do that and shoal around within the water, moving in huge groups. It's a fantastic sight to be able to see. And partially, they can afford to be that out in the open, again, because many things aren't going to be eating them within that water body itself. But a fantastic thing to be able to spot. I will only very briefly go on to this. There is, unfortunately, quite a long list of non-native frogs and toads that you can find within the UK. Some more commonly than others, and also some more commonly found in specific parts of the UK. So it's very possible, wherever you may live, that you may know of a population of one of these non-natives nearby, or you may come across them every so often if you're going out to look for some of our amphibians. So just to have a little look here, we've got the midwife toad in the top left. We've got the fire-bellied toad in the bottom left, we've got the African clawed toad in the bottom right, and we've got the marsh frog in the top right. So just to highlight here, even within the most urban of places, we've got right in the heart of Lambeth, within London, we have a population of midwife toads. Very, very strange to have a population of non-natives in a place like that, most likely released by someone, whether that was by accident, from moving plants from one place to another, or deliberately. But you can tell, even if you can't spot a midwife toad, you will be able to tell if they're within a pond near you. Because I think this wins for the most strange call of any of our amphibians today. So it's almost like an electronic beep that you'd hear in and around the ponds. A very odd thing to hear in the evenings, if you're by the pond size. But it is a species every so often you may come up against. In these cases, what you would do is you'd be reporting that not only to us through something like the Dragon Finder app, which I'll talk about later on, but also to whoever your local biodiversity officer is or your local authority, just so they're aware of what's there. Now in the top right, this very traditional looking frog, very, very green, quite a large looking frog, is the marsh frog. There is quite a lot of marsh frogs and marsh frog populations within the southeast of the UK. So all across sort of Kent into Sussex, and even within London, there's quite a few of these. Now they are pretty big frogs. Quite a lot of the ones I've come across have actually been about the same size as my head. So they're big frogs, and one of their biggest issues with them, occupying the same places as our native frogs, is due to that size, they outcompete lots of our native species within those areas. I often get asked, what do amphibians eat? And the simplest answer to that is whatever they can fit in their mouths. So the minute you become the largest frog in and around the pond is the moment that you will take over on eating things. They're also cannibalistic. They'll eat smaller marsh frogs or anything that they can get hold of within that space. So they are a species to keep an eye out for. and depending on where you're going within the UK, you may spot them. I once had a child say to me they've probably got the most sinister or very, very sort of scary sounding call, which I'll play for you now. Almost sounds like a cackle, which does make me think they've sat at the pond edge knowing they're taking over. But it's something very much to be aware of. But if you're ever hearing this sort of ducks quacking sound, but you can't see any ducks or anything like that nearby, it's very possible there could be marsh frogs within that pond. Now, some of you may be asking yourself or thinking, why on that bottom right hand is there an African clawed toad? Because even the name suggests it's very far away from its natural range. And very sadly, that's down to us of why there are African clawed toad populations in the UK. There aren't many anymore, but before modern day pregnancy testing, we used to use African clawed toads to test if a woman was pregnant. We'd expose African clawed toads to female urine. If that female was pregnant, this toad here would produce spawn, and that's how we used to test for it. And there used to be quite a lot of African clawed toads within labs around sort of mid and South Wales. Lots of those were harvested from the wild in South Africa, brought over to the UK for this testing purpose. The minute our system changed and we went to the sort of peeing onto a stick to tell us if someone was pregnant, a lot of these got released into the wild. The plot thickens with this in that it wasn't until 1993 that they realised many of those clawed toads they'd released across parts of Wales had chytrid. Now, I'm going to go on to disease later on, but chytrid is the biggest disease affecting our amphibians globally right now, and it is the one that has caused amphibians overall to be in their 6th mass extinction event right now. So that was the first instance of it being brought into the UK that was sort of on record. Now, that's not, of course, going to be the only time that it's been introduced here, but it's quite a big time when that did occur, and they have tried their best to eradicate many of the populations of these now. But just to be mindful of that, whether we have pets or anyone you know that keeps herps, amphibians and reptiles as pets, to not release them into the wild. I'd always hope a pet owner wouldn't do that, but just to make sure that there could be other knock-on effects if we were to do that. So let's go on to our salamanders, our newt species here. So to clarify that, all newts are salamanders, but not all salamanders are newts. So Matilda wasn't wrong when she thought it was a salamander within that little jar that she found within the film. But the key sort of differentiating between them is that salamanders spend most of their lifetime on land, whereas newts tend to be 50-50. So half the time in the water, half the time in the land, whereas salamanders are only really visiting the water just to breed, and that's it, rest of the time out. So we'll start off with our smooth newt. So for anyone sort of living centrally within the UK or anywhere basically in the southeast, it's most likely smooth newts that you're coming across more often within ponds. And they're pretty stunning looking little things overall, but they have this quite yellow or orange underside with lots of black spots on them. And just like our sort of fingerprints, that's completely unique to them. So you can get, if you really wish to and you want to get an idea of the size of your population in your back garden, by all means, go out, take photos of every single newt's belly, and you can see how many individuals you actually have within that space. One of the key things we do look for, though, when identifying a smooth newt is we're looking at their underside. So that sort of belly with all the spots, if those spots continue up onto that chin and that chin stays sort of a pale cream or sometimes even white looking chin, then you know it's a smooth newt versus another newt we're going to talk about in a moment. Now, very similar to the bird world here, the males are far more brightly marked than females. They have the job of getting noticed, so they put lots and lots of energy into their sort of breeding attire. So you can see here on the bottom left, he has this lovely sort of smooth and seamless undulating crest, which starts here at the base of his head. And you can see it here going all the way down with my very, very poor mouse cursor skills, all the way to the base of his tail. So we can see that doesn't have any breaks in that crest at all. And that's a really important ID feature to remember with smooth newts. If you find a newt with a crest and it continues the whole length of their body, then you know it's a smooth newt that we found. The next part, and it's actually quite hard to spot on this photo I've chosen, is on their back feet. they've got sort of a fringe around their toes. So the best way to explain this, although it's a bit of a weird analogy, is if you went to somewhere like Poundland or somewhere that sold very, very cheap plastic toys, and you ever see where they've heat sealed the joins in the plastic, you have that slight plastic filament around the edge. If you're spotting that, that's essentially what the toes look like on a male smooth newt. So it's that very, very light and thin fringing around each of their toes. So it's another feature to be able to look at if you're spotting them out and about. Now, the females are far more muted or muddy in colour than the males. They tend to be a lot less brightly marked. So they'll tend to be more of a sort of flatter, just brown coloration. And their bellies also reflect that. So a lot smaller belly spots than the males. Arguably, that's for the most important reason, that the males need to be noticed, whereas the females ideally shouldn't be noticed and should have the chance to be able to lay the eggs within the pond without any form of predator noticing her as much. So it's better for her to be less obvious than the males in the pond itself. One incredible thing that I'm really another thing to add to your list of things to do this year, sorry, I'm going to fill up everybody's social calendars, is when we get to around April time, please do go out. If you have a garden pond or you have a pond locally that you know has newts in, go out with a torch and genuinely shine that torch into the water and watch our newt species do their courtship displays. I think quite often people don't think about the life that's happening under the surface of a pond, and newts particularly have an elaborate courtship display that's wonderful to see. So the male, not only does he look like that, when he approaches a female that he wishes to breed with, he'll swim round to the back of her, he'll nudge her cloaca, which is her sort of breeding sort of area or pouch for her organs, right at the back of her body between her hind legs. When she knows he's there, he'll swim in front of her, he'll do a series of tail flicks to get all of his pheromones pumped towards her face. Or again, for another terrible analogy, if you think about going into sort of a male locker room and it smells like Lynx Africa, you're definitely aware that he's there and he's present. The minute she angles her body and faces him, he'll then go completely vertically in the water and he'll swim in big sort of figures of 8, showing off that body pattern, all those sort of belly spots that you can see, and showcasing really that he has the ability of all this energy he can spend on being able to do these displays. If she's interested, he'll then lead her to a more secluded part of the pond, go down to the pond floor, he'll lay a single spermatophore and stay around her until she's taken that up inside of her, and then later on we'll lay eggs with that. But it's a fantastic courtship to be able to see with our amphibian species, and I really do urge you to go out and have a look. I think it's a fascinating thing that happens. Our other small newt species, so if you're right down into sort of Dorset, Devon way, Cornwall, or if you live basically anywhere really within Scotland, the newt you're most likely to find that's the small newt within your ponds will be the palmate newt. So the palmate newt's roughly the same size as our smooth newt, so we're looking at about sort of 7 to 9 centimetres in sizing. They have quite a yellow underside, which you can just about see actually on these 2 photos here. But it's quite a sort of more pastel yellow that you're looking for with their coloration, and it doesn't have any of those spots that smooth newt had. That's a key feature we're looking for. The other thing is, when I mentioned that chin previously, the palmate newt has an almost translucent or very, very pink looking sort of chin here. That's another good way of telling that it's a palmate newt you found and not a smooth newt. Again, there's differences between the males and females. So the males are the photos on the left-hand side of our screen here. They have these sort of webbed hind feet, or they almost look like clubs. Very, very useful when looking in your pond or when out surveying, because when you look straight down, if you don't have murky water or anything like that, you can tell. If it's very, very dark in these places, then you'll be able to tell that it's a palmate newt that you're spotting, because you can't see each individual toe like you would be able to on the smooth newt. The other thing is when we look at his body. So if we go all the way down to the bottom, you'll see that he completely lacks a crest. So he does have a very, very small ridge that runs along his back, which if you saw him in person, you would notice, but from a photo like this or from a profile of just of sort of the side or the front, you wouldn't notice it definitively. And then you'll see that the tail almost fans out. So it sort of goes out, very, very long, fanned out, but with no crest, and ends in only the tiniest of little filaments here. Apologies to anyone that might be viewing this on a mobile device, as this might be very small images for you. There's plenty more photos on our website and on the Dragon Finder app if you did want to zoom in a little bit more to have a look. Female palmate newts. Admittedly, I think this comes up with probably one of the hardest things to tell the difference between with our newt species. Female smooth newts and female palmate newts are very, very similar in the way that they look, particularly out of the water. One thing you can do is a little bit intrusive, but if you were to pick up the newt and flip it over, if you saw these tiny little white nodules, so these little dots you can see here, at the back of their hind legs, then you'll know that that's a palmate newt that you found. So that's a female palmate newt that has that, whereas the smooth newt females won't have any nodules there whatsoever. So that is a key way to be able to tell. The other thing though, that I'll be brutally honest, if you're looking in a pond and you think you've seen a female palmate newt or a female smooth newt, if it's around breeding time, so springtime, early summer, I'd probably keep an eye on that female. It won't be long until a male newt will turn up and you will see what his attire is like and whether you can confirm the ID of either a palmate newt or a smooth newt at that point, just as a sort of top tip when you're out looking at your newts. So just to sort of push home that point really about their underside and how it's different, we can see that smooth newt has all of those spots. It's quite a bright yellow within its belly, and that goes all the way up to that throat, whereas that palmate newt a little bit different. So it has that completely translucent chin there and very, very sort of mellowed coloration on its belly. Now, it wouldn't be a talk about newts without, of course, the oldest newt species we have in the UK and the biggest. So great crested newts have been on Earth for about 40 million years. They're a very, very old species here, very, very special species. They are our largest species. So if you were to look down at your hand now, generally, particularly the females, will be about the same size as the entire length of your hand. So from the tip of your middle finger down to the base of your palm, the kind of sizing we're looking at. A colleague of mine used to say, if you ever look into a pond and you think you've seen a great crested newt, you haven't. If you looked into a pond and you go, oh my goodness, that thing is massive, then you probably have found a great crested newt. They are significantly larger than our other two newt species we've spoken about, probably about double the size. So it's a good sort of idea when you're looking at them. So when we're looking at their kind of coloration, what we're looking for here is that sort of bright yellow underside. Sometimes it looks a little bit orange with all of these sort of black spots or splodges. Splodges, definitely not a technical term, but I find is a really good way of explaining that they aren't perfectly circular like the smooth newt that often has circular belly patterns. Very, very rough and warty skin. So particularly here you can see on the left, it's quite granular. So if you were to ever feel a great crested newt, if you were out on a survey or someone with a license, you'd be able to feel they're quite a different feeling newt. And it actually wasn't until the mid-90s that great crested newts got the name great crested newt. They used to be called the warty newt, hence why we have our smooth newt. But I think they've lucked out with a better name change. It's far more grand in that case. The other thing with this sort of granular skin is when we look along the side of their body, you can see there's this white stippling. It runs all the way down from their chin, all the way down the side of their body. That's another thing to look out for with your great crested newts. And if you were to get them out of the water, like we can see right in the middle picture here, they almost look jet black in the way their sort of coloration is when they come out and they're still damp. Very different to our two small newt species that are quite a light brown brought out of the water. These differences are also apparent between the male and female. They are quite different. The males very much are a great crested newt with a great crest. They've got that tall, jagged crest that begins at the head, is very, very high, but ends at the hips, unlike that smooth newt's crest, which ran all the way down its body. That's a key thing we look for there. And then the other thing, which we can see in that middle photo, oh, if I can find my cursor, there we go. We can see it's got that white stripe. Now that is probably the single most useful ID feature that great crested newts have, in that if you're in any kind of murky pond and you've shone a torch into there in the evening time, you will know if you get a stripe that reflects that light straight back at you, then you know you've got something quite special within that space there. So it's certainly a very useful thing for us to look out for within the water itself. Females, a bit different, as I mentioned, they're slightly larger than the males. They lack a crest completely, so we can see here, she very much still is a warty newt, but has lucked out with the name change. And she doesn't have that white line along sort of the center of her tail, but she has a very, very thin yellow line at the base of her tail. So essentially where her belly's quite yellow, that just continues along the bottom of her tail. Now, if any of you have children at home or are keen on sort of Pixar films or anything like that, this great crested newt at the top might look quite familiar to you. So lots of popular dragons that you find in popular media or anything like that are fashioned on great crested newts. So Toothless, the dragon from How to Train Your Dragon, is very much the great crested newt in the way that its face is shaped, in kind of its age, and quite often with the crests and the way that they move, either whether it's within water, they've kind of emulated that within the sky. It's quite an interesting animal to look at and how people have speak about it through the future. So we can tell differences all the way at the back at the beginning again. So although it's almost impossible to tell the difference between the palmate newt and the smooth newt egg, which we can see there on the left-hand side, they're both about 1 to 2 millimeters in size, and they're sort of quite a creamy colour. So we can just about see on this photo here, it's quite a creamy small egg within that sort of jelly, and that would be hidden in that leaf. So newts, female newts, lay their eggs one by one, and she can lay up to 300 of these. She'll go around every single plant or sort of small leaf that she can essentially pinch and close over and fold in half. She'll lay a single egg in that leaf, and then she'll hold with her back legs to hold that leaf in half. Now, there was a show called Nature's New Wild a while ago from the BBC that had a GoPro in a canal in Manchester that is phenomenal for this. It shows a female newt doing this over every single plant within sort of the canal way that it was within. So a fantastic way if you want to see that whole process happening. Whereas our great crested newt looks quite different, the egg, compared to the smaller species. It's very large, so we're looking at about 4 to 5 millimeters in size, and it is bright white. This photo doesn't do it any justice at all for how bright it is, but essentially, like if you were to look at a sheet of paper now, a bit of A4 paper, that kind of bright white that you'd expect is what you'll see in a great crested newt egg. Now, this is all easy to say when we've got two there that are comparable, but if ever in doubt, by all means take a photo if you've just found newt eggs around, and by all means email it to us. Everyone at Froglife's lovely and would happily help you out with identification of anything like this. If you never know, you might have something very special within your pond. You can also tell those differences on their larval stage. So we can see here this great crested newt. A very important thing to notice with this is that on his tail fin, so you can see here, it has lots and lots of black dots. So if you're seeing lots of black dots along that tail fin, then you know it's a great crested newt larvae that you've got within the pond. Whereas for smooth and palmate, there is no dots or additional patterns or coloration within that tail fin. I do also think it's quite hard to tell the difference between smooth and palmate newt larvae within a pond itself. I think it's all great and good me showing you a photo of 3 of them together, but it's a lot more difficult if you're just there and you're not sure what adults were in the pond earlier on in the season. But it's certainly an interesting thing to be able to spot, and also might be something that you may have come across even throughout winter time within the ponds, because sometimes our small newt species don't manage to metamorphosize all the way into adult newts where they're out of water, and they will spend time right down in sort of the silt layer of the pond itself. Again, I'll be very brief with looking at the non-native newts. We have 2 non-native newts that we do spot every so often within the UK. We have the Italian crested newt, which is very similar looking to the great crested newt, except it's a lot more stout and it's almost like you've taken a great crested newt and then you've compressed it a little bit in that sense. But there hasn't been many of those noticed or recorded in the past few years. And then we have the Alpine newt, which is the pictured one below, the one pictured below. Alpine newts, very, very visually stunning. There's lovely sort of iridescent blue kind of coloration. They have bright orange bellies with no spots, very widely used in the pet trade, and sadly quite a few get released into the wild. Lots of people think, oh well, it's a newt that could have lived in Paris in a pond, so why don't I just release it in my garden in Birmingham and then just let it go. Very, very sadly we come across them in like this. It is a problem species for us, as it is a species that has been identified as a vector for certain diseases. So something like Chytrid B cell rather, that affect our other newt species can be carried on the skin of an alpine newt without affecting it. So it is a species, if you do spot, please do record it and report it to your local authority, just so they're aware in that sense. But again, I will go on to disease later on. So now time for you to get your pens, pencils and notepads ready. If any of you are watching this in a group, by all means, you can make it competitive if you wish. I'm just going to show you 8 different sort of amphibians, and I'd like you to try your best at identifying them. By all means, you can either write it on paper or you can put it in the chat. It's completely up to you, and we'll go through and see what you've taken in. I am aware you've had like an hour of me talking everything at you, near enough. So it's a lot of information to take in at once, but we'll see how you go. So, in the top left, who do you think that is? If you can identify the sex of any of the amphibians you're looking at, by all means have a go. I'm not inclined to give a half point, but you know, maybe. And in the top right, who do we think that is? What amphibian are we looking at there? And in the bottom left, who's that we're looking at? And in the bottom right, what species do you think that is? Okay, we'll go on to our next one. Top left, who is that? Top right, what is that you're looking at? Bottom left, who's that we're looking at? And bottom right, listen in. Who is this? Okay, I think that's enough time. I'm going to go back and we'll see who we have. So top left, number 1, we have a male smooth newt. And we can tell that because we can see that long undulating smooth crest on its back that doesn't break at all. We can see it's got a lovely bright orange belly with lots of spots running all the way up to its chin. So that is our male smooth newt. And to the right, we have a male palmate newt. So we can see it doesn't have a crest, but it has that lovely fanned out tail here that ends in that tiny little filament. We also have these large club-like back feet, which if you'd looked at the feet there is a nice indication to show us it's a palmate newt. Bottom left, I like this photo because it's more of the reality of when we do end up seeing some of these amphibians. You're turning over your compost heap, or you're just sort of digging up your potatoes and you're covered in mud, as is the amphibian. This is what we're looking at here. So we're looking at a lovely common frog. So we can see there it's got that glossy skin that we're looking at. If you've got very good eyes and aren't on a tiny sort of smartphone device or anything like that, you may have even spotted it's got striped back legs right back there. And it does have this eye mask, but it's quite hard to see with all the mud and bits of sort of debris all over it. Bottom right hand corner is a common frog tadpole. So again, we're looking for that brown coloration with these gold speckles that shows us it's a common frog tadpole. Top left, almost looks jet black outside of the water, very granular skin, white stippling that we can see all the way from its chin down, that white line across its tail, and if you've got keen eyes, that jagged crest that's flopped over onto its back. It is our very wonderful male great crested newt that we're looking at in the top left. Top right, great crested newt larvae. So we can see it's got those black dots we were talking about on its tail fin. So it's quite a young one, this one, so it hasn't got loads, but we can see the fact it's got any tells us it's great crested newt. Bottom left, as we all agreed earlier, most handsome animal, the lovely common toad, James Bond in essence here. So it's got that lovely golden eye, that horizontal pupil. We can see those parotoid glands and we can see all of that bumpy skin within its body. And I'll play this very briefly for you. The sound that number 7 would be making within the pond, it is our common toad within the pond itself. And because it is vocalizing like that, it would be a male that we're listening to there. Whereas the females won't be making many sounds at all. It's also a top tip for if you ever pick up a toad and you accidentally have squeezed it behind its shoulder blades and it makes a loud sort of squeak or noise, then you know it's a male. That's his release call saying, hey, I'm a male, let go, don't mate with me. Whereas if it's completely silent, it would be a female common toad that you've picked up. So now we know that we can identify what we would find. When should we go looking for them? So the best time to look for these animals, pretty much from now onwards. As I said earlier, some people may be very lucky that are joining us tonight and may have already seen some of these amphibians out and about already. But common frogs, generally looking from about mid-February through to March. Although, to be fair, I think our first records of even frog spawn this year came the beginning of December. So it might be you've spotted some common frogs out and about already. Common toads, their mass migration back to the ponds generally happens from sort of March through to April. Some sites right in the southwest maybe slightly earlier. And then as we head further north in the UK, it gets a little bit later. I know for certain here within London, our common toads tend to move within the first 2 weeks of March. That's when they tend to get their marching orders and they head back to the ponds. And generally, year on year, you can tell whenabouts it's going to be. Our newts come in a little bit later on, so they come from about mid-April through to June, and that's the best times to be going out with your torch in the evening time to have a little look to see what you can find if there's any courtship displays for you. Pretty much all of those non-natives we spoke about would be slightly later than their counterparts here. Many of our non-natives that come from slightly warmer climates, whether that's sort of southern parts of Europe or places like that, would be breeding slightly later. Not many are as hardy as some of our species here that breed quite early in our very sort of colder temperate climate. So if you was to spot any of these species here, what should you do? Now, it's very possible, I did realise, being the 4th webinar in this series, if any of you in webinar 1 downloaded the Dragon Finder app, you may have got full marks on that identification quiz. But if you do spot any of our animals out and about, please do record them. So we have the Dragon Finder app, which is free for you to download. And all that does, it sends us a GPS mark of where that species was found. And it's really important for us, as many of our projects are funded by grants. It means that we can only focus projects into specific areas. So if we know there's a population of toads in a certain place that need a little bit more help or habitat around them improved, your records from your gardens or your local parks is really important for us to focus where that money should be best spent. And you never know, it might be we've never had a record of a common frog in your area, but your garden's full of them. So it's great for us to be able to know in that space. If there's anything that you're ever not sure what you found, you can also just take a photo, send it through, and our team here will happily identify it for you in that sense, or get in touch if we need a little bit more information about what you did spot. So please do record. Again, I'm going back to that fluffy animals. So our mammals and our birds tend to get recorded pretty well within the UK, but quite underrepresented in sort of national biodiversity sort of network overall is our amphibians and reptiles. So if everyone tonight goes out and gets recording, we can certainly start to reverse that sort of trend we're finding. Now, I've been all positive about us all getting out and spotting them, but there are many reasons why we may not find amphibians out and about. And I won't go too heavy into all of this. I suppose it could be its own talk in itself, but there's a lot of threats that affect our amphibians, even here within the UK. A big one is habitat loss or degradation. So it is estimated that we've lost about 1/3 of our ponds in the UK in the past 50 years. So not least the fact that those breeding areas don't exist anymore is a big issue for our amphibians. Degradation as well. So that could be, I imagine everybody here tonight can imagine one pond in their local area that probably needs a bit of management or a bit of help. So whether that pond now looks more like a bog or now has turned into its end goal of succession and become a woodland, they do need a bit of help every few years to make sure that we're not allowing succession to happen in those places. Habitat fragmentation or disruption of migration routes. This is very commonly seen. The more and more we urbanise areas and head into green belts or anything like that, you will find that the more roads or sort of hard standing or sort of new buildings or developments that start to cut up the landscape make some of our species really struggle. Common toads particularly struggle with that. So a common toad could walk up to 3 kilometres to get back to its breeding pond. Now, I know very much from where I'm sitting tonight, I'd be hard pressed to go 100 metres without hitting a road, let alone other buildings. So something very much to think about when we're thinking about sort of planning or how we plan out habitats for some of our species. Road mortality is another big factor that we spoke about earlier on. Sorry for the gruesome photo in the middle, but it's a big factor for particularly the toads, but it's not just them that suffer with this. There's also many other species groups that are affected by deaths on roads. So again, please do get out and get involved. If there's any roads near you as well, that you are aware there are toads always crossing in springtime, but no one ever goes out and monitor, by all means get in touch with us. We'll help you set up a sort of new toad patrol for that area and try and get you a bit more support on how you can best help the toads in your area in that place. Introduction of non-natives. We touched upon it earlier on. If we're moving anything in that completely outcompetes our native species, it's something very much for us to think about. Disease, I'll come on to that in a little bit of time, but there's a lot of our species that are at threat of whole population wipeouts from diseases that may be in and around places. Pollution is a massive thing for our amphibians. With their very porous skin, they're heavily affected by any pollution events. One of the places very near me had a pollution event in a local river, and all of the sort of storage ponds that were very near to it had a sort of mass die-off of all their amphibians over a period of a year. And that's when they found out people had been dumping oils and things into the water body. They're one of the first sort of indicator species, almost like the canary in the mines, to show you there's something not quite right within that water itself, something to be mindful of. And climate change, although that's a very broad sort of 2 words to put it under, but a big factor of that is, and I touched upon it earlier on, that our amphibians shouldn't be out and about and laying spawn really, really early on in the season. The very, very mild winters are causing lots of our amphibians to have periods of activity. So they're sort of waking up from their hibernation or brumation, being active, potentially even breeding before the season's there, and then they're struggling to sort of successfully breed when it gets to about February time. And that is a worry for us. We're finding many populations have sort of a very low or very, very sort of bad body condition by the time it gets to breeding time. So something very much to be mindful of within these spaces, especially when we start to see some of these very seasonal animals out and about when they shouldn't be. I won't dwell on a licensing page too much because I'm aware it's getting late and I don't want you all to switch off before we get on to the other bits. But there is a lot of legislation that does help or tries to protect our amphibians and reptiles and many other sort of facets of wildlife here in the UK. But the main one that affects all of our species here is the Wildlife and Countryside Act. So what that does for our species is it stops the sort of mass killing of our species. So you can't really just go out and decide, I'm going to kill all of those frogs in that place. That wouldn't be okay by law. And if you ever knew that someone was doing that on their land or anything like that, you can report that through to the police and they can investigate that. And the second facet, which again, it's a good time for us to do this talk, is about the sale of sort of wild caught or wild sourced amphibians and reptiles. So a big thing here is frog spawn. Sadly, we see a peak every single springtime of websites like eBay or even actually Facebook Marketplace where people are selling frog spawn on. That's an absolute no-no, not only because the legislation is there, but even in your best intentions of wanting to have more and more frog spawn everywhere, the last thing you'd like to do or want to do is move a disease from one pond into a new pond and spread a wider issue, which will actually lead to the decline of a species. So if you ever spot anything like that sold online, please do report it and also get in touch with us about that. There's loads of information about licensing on our website if you do need a bit of help with anything like this. I was advised to put a white slide in before I show you the next one in case anyone is eating dinner or anything like that right now, just to touch upon some of the amphibian diseases that we may find here in the UK. It is a couple of sort of gnarly images in the next slide. In case you are eating or in case you don't want to see this, that's fine. I'll talk you through each of the pictures, but it'll be about a minute or so in length. So on the left-hand side of the screen, we're looking at, well, the top left, we're looking at a very extreme case of Chytrid BD. So that's the chytrid fungus that affects our anurans, so our frogs and toads. What's happening here is that amphibian is shedding a layer of its skin quite profusely. And it may be that that fungus, the more and more it grows onto that amphibian, the more and more it will try and shed, or the more likely that it will be suffocated from the outside in. So that's a very extreme case of chytrid. What I would say to you is if you ever spot an amphibian acting abnormally in your garden or in a space, so it could be the middle of summer and it's just sitting on your patio, and it has been for the past 2 days, slightly emaciated, not attempting to get food or shade or stay damp at all, then please do get in touch with Garden Wildlife Health. They're our partners on any sort of wildlife health, disease spread or anything like that in the UK, as they may be interested to know if there is any disease or any issue at play there. So that's a very extreme case there. Bottom left is Chytrid B sal. So that's the chytrid fungus that affects our newt species here in the UK. That is also the fungus that's carried by alpine newts. So not all alpine newts, but if the alpine newt has had that, it can carry it on its skin without any effect. And the more and more it goes into other ponds, it will spread that to our native newt species. That's of particular concern to our great crested newt. because not only do they both like the same type of pond, it's also the most susceptible to contracting that disease. And it's a very horrible disease for them to have. This is probably quite a nice photo of it. There are a lot worse things that happen later stage in chytrid B sow, and it's very much something that, yeah, we'd like to know more about, and certainly would like you to report it if you ever see this. A big reason why chytrid B sow needs to be reported if it's spotted is that chytrid B sow thrives at around 18 degrees Celsius, which our summers are pretty consistent with that. Chytrid BD, which we've had for about 30 years in the UK, we don't often see frogs looking like that top left picture, because that one thrives at about 24 degrees Celsius. So we have a slightly more of a buffer there. And it is a big concern for us. We are aware we have chytrid B sow in the UK in captive populations, but not yet out in the wild. And in the northern parts of the Netherlands and the sort of basically the tip of Germany, they've had massive issues with this, where lots of fire salamanders, well, actually 99.8% of all of their fire salamanders have died off in the past 10 years because of chytrid B sow. So it's a big worry to us right now. So please do report if you spot anything like this. The middle top, so these photos here, this is ranavirus. So earlier on I mentioned about red coloured frogs. It is very obvious if you find sort of red limbs or blisters or lesions on an amphibian skin. So this is what we look for with sort of the red leg disease or ranavirus in itself. If you're seeing these blisters or anything like that, again, please do report it to Garden Wildlife Health. They will advise you of what they'd like you to do with that individual, or if there's lots within the population. This newt on the right hand side, you don't see this often, and it isn't necessarily life-threatening or infectious for these newt species here. That's an example of a dermocystic parasite living within that newt skin. Some newts can coexist with it throughout their entire life and they're fine, but again, please do report it. It's something we don't see often enough that we know everything about it, so please do report. And in the bottom right, I've added this one in for this talk because it's something that will be more prevalent in the next couple of months. So this is amphibian herpes. So during the breeding season, if an animal is infected with herpes, they get these sort of blue blotches all across their skin. So again, please do report it at the earliest you spot it to Garden Wildlife Health, and they'll advise whether or not they want that amphibian removed from that population to basically not spread it. But we can combat that, not only by reporting it and us getting more information about how it's all spreading and what's happening in the UK, but also using the check, clean, dry procedure. So this is basically biosecurity in essence, and it's just making sure that we are checking all of the equipment, or even our boots, or actually, if you're a keen dog walker, even your dog's paws. If your dog loves running in and out of ponds and they're coming out and they are covered in sort of vegetation from those ponds and that, make sure you sort of hose down those paws when you get home, make sure that it is clean. Some of those diseases that we just talked about can live up to 2 weeks out of water on dry leaves. So that if that dog runs into a pond that day, and then in 2 days' time, you go into a different park with another pond, it's very possible even dogs and us and our boots can be vectors. I won't talk too much about this. You can by all means go to that link and learn a little bit more. You can use bleach solutions for that. You can use things like Virkon tablets that are just a little sort of light disinfectant just to clean off and kill anything off your feet with that. To make sure I have time to give a quick question talk, I'll just summarize here and then I'll take the floor with questions. How can you take action straight away? Well, of course, I've mentioned it many times. Please do record what you see. There's many eyes, even on this call tonight. There's many people here. You all have access to something that's local to you, whether that's your local park or even your garden. Please do record what you see. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to have. I know personally, I love my inbox being filled with pictures of frogs that people spot. I've never complained about that. Get involved with your local Toads on Roads patrol if there is one near you. You can just pop your postcode in on our website and it will let you know what's nearby. You can, if you aren't already, you can become a friend of Froglife. So it's less than the price of a coffee a month, and you can support some of the work that we're doing in being able to sort of be here as an information source and give talks like this if you wish to. You can sign our petition. That's where we're lobbying right now. MPs and highways agencies for wildlife tunnels, and that mitigations really needs to be put in for ground dwelling animals. Build a pond, of course. We have a free guide on our website called Just Add Water. Ponds can cost as little as £5. You just put a bucket in the ground with a bit of water. They will be used, even if it's not to breed in straight away. They'll be used for cooling off in summer, anything like that, and they just add so much biodiversity to your garden. So please do it. Biosecurity, we just touched upon that. Just be aware. I always think of this, and I think it's important to say, because in my job, I visit so many different parks and places. It's so important for someone like me doing something that I'm very lucky that I love doing. If I was the person spreading a disease around, you know, it wouldn't be great. And if lots of people are keen in this and you like visiting lots of ponds, making sure that we're only visiting those ponds with clean boots and equipment. And the last one, which is by far, I think, the most important thing, anyone that stops and gives you a split second of their time, tell them about them. Not enough people hear all about our amphibians and reptiles. And yeah, they add so much to the UK wildlife sort of landscape. And I just think they're so important. And yeah, I think we'll leave it there. You've probably heard enough of me talking. So I'll open up to questions. So I did get 3 questions beforehand. I'll just read those out and then address them, and then I'll pass over to Sheila, who's been monitoring the chat for any questions for me. The first question I did get was, I've got newts and frogs in my pond. Will that be a problem? I've read that newts will eat frog spawn. So that is true, newts will eat frog spawn. Newts aren't daft. Not only do they enter the pond slightly later than the frogs do, so they're already in there by the time the frog spawn's laid. It's basically a free protein buffet that's left at the top. The male newts particularly will go up and eat frog spawn to gain the energy to dance with the females. That's not at all a problem. We love newts too, and what will happen, it could take a few years, but it's somewhat cyclical. So you could have an absolute newt population boom within your pond where you have hundreds of them all within there. Once they hit a certain point, what happens is they all spread out. So they tend to leave that pond and it goes back to a natural balance, and your frogs will return and they'll get to a point where it's a reasonable carrying capacity. So don't worry too much about them living together. Second question I received was, I found a small newt in the pond this December. Shouldn't it have left the pond? Good question. So if newts don't manage to metamorphosize into their adult forms and leave the ponds, what will happen is they'll stay in that silt layer or that mud layer at the bottom of the pond. And then right now, they'll start to wake up within that pond and just keep eating. So you might end up looking in the pond and find some really, really chunky newts that are ready to leave the pond, but they're just coming a little bit later than they should have. On the odd occasion, you can also find neotenous newts, almost like Peter Pan newts. They stay with external gills throughout their entire life, and they actually never grow into an adult newt. But yeah, good question. Nothing too much to worry about within the pond itself. The key thing there is that if we have a cold frost or anything, float a ball or something on top of the surface to not let it freeze over, because those amphibians at the bottom will still need a bit of oxygen exchange. And the last question I received earlier on today was, what plants are good for newts? Great question. So because newts lay their eggs one by one onto each leaf, you're looking for pretty much small broadleaf plants. So things like bob bean, water forget-me-not, water mint are all perfect for newts to be able to lay eggs on. Yeah, I'll pass over to Sheila now if she has any questions that she's picked up.
We've had quite fluid just the last couple of minutes. One earlier one was about any advice on setting up a toad patrol, but that's been covered in the chat. So there's been quite a few answers to that one. So that one's all fine. Now this one I have to give you a time limit on because I know you could go on for quite a long time on this one, which is, how should you maintain your pond for toads, frogs and newts?
Perfect. So depending on the size of your pond, let's presume it's a standard garden pond, maybe about 1 meter by 2 meters. I'd probably go for about once a year, so probably around early November. Get in, clear out a bit of the vegetation so it doesn't become too swamped with any vegetation going over the top. Toads, if they're using the pond, you are very lucky. They're the most picky of all 3 of those species you mentioned. They like that deeper body of water. So please do, even if you find it's becoming too silted at the bottom or there's too much leaf litter, remove a little bit of that, leave it at the edge. I would advise you only not to do that. If you start doing that and you find there's loads and loads of amphibians still in that pond, then by all means cease operations of clearing that pond. Sometimes you have very keen bean male frogs that stay in the water waiting for spring. I think it's quite focused there. It's a good thing to do, and keep it very biodiverse with your plants. So mix up your plants. Toads like the long stemmed things, so you can have anything like flag irises that they'll weave around laying their spawn. And again with the newts, small broadleaf plants. Is that okay?
That's good and concise. Yep. Okay, now I know you've had many questions thrown at you in the past, Emily, but this one could be a new one.
Okay.
What do you think makes frogs so popular in the LGBTQI community?
Oh, that's a very interesting question.
Have you had that one before?
I don't think, no, I have not had I think maybe with frogs, they're pretty accessible animals. I think full stop. They're quite a happy animal. They're quite free in themselves. They have the ability to move within different areas, whether that's sort of in their case on land or within water. And I think maybe there's that sort of resonance that they're just a very, very happy group. And I would say in general, herpetologists are a lovely group of people, and I feel that maybe it feels like quite a safe space to be amongst people that accept anything and everything. Maybe, I don't know. It's not necessarily my social sort of issues or anything like that. I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you. Right, another one bit more back to the science is, what is it that eats frogs, toads, and leaves their insides on the top of nearby fence posts? From the name, it could be that this person lives in Somerset, though there might be someone else with that name.
Okay,
so
so
just to give a bit of a clue.
Leave insides on the fence post.
Yeah.
Okay. It could be a variety of different things. So sometimes it can be birds, although tends to be though with a bird, something like a heron, they'll tend to attack it by sort of a stab and then they'll eat. But it might be if they've eaten part of it or they've eaten the outside, then the rest is just left. With toads, it's actually generally the other way around. So I'd suspect a bird for a toad if you're finding just the insides, because they're about the only thing some species of waterfowl will eat the exterior of the toad, but most mammals won't. So if you ever found just toad skin, then you know it's a mammal getting them, generally otters and things like that. Yeah, probably a bird. I mean, I suppose it could be something else. Yeah, it's an odd thing to leave behind, seeing as that would have quite a lot of the protein you'd be wanting as an animal. Yeah, interesting.
Okay, got a question which was sent by a private message to Froglife, which is, do newts make a noise? And this is from Freya, who's 8.
Great question, Freya. They don't. So newts don't make a noise, nothing audible that we'd hear. They certainly will use different sort of movements and certainly vibrations they'll feel. So if they feel vibrations, they will tend to be quite static within places. Within the water, we tend to find them, I don't necessarily know by communicating, it tends to be more visual with newts. So they'll alert each other to their presence by movement. But yeah, within sort of signaling or trying to communicate with each other, I suppose generally it's movement with amphibians. But that is a fantastic question to ask. Thinking outside the box there.
Yeah. Okay. Next, is it a problem if your pond is totally covered in duckweed?
It can become a problem. So a little bit of duckweed's not an issue. The problem that you'll find that if you have too much duckweed on the surface of the water, basically the sunlight will never get to the bottom. And then what you'll end up finding is you'll start to get that sort of sulphurous smell as things are breaking down at the bottom of the pond. It's also why actually after sort of winter time, or if there's ever been any frosts, ponds tend to smell. It's just because all of that bacteria that digests any leaf litter at the bottom, it doesn't do too well when it's too cold. So if you're basically stopping any sort of sunlight and the heat from that getting into the water, it's very likely you'll start to sort of suffocate the pond a bit. So if you can clear it, great. I mean, generally you can sort of use the fan rakes to get a bit of it out. If you're finding it as a consistent problem, possibly plant some sort of very nutrient hungry plants. So flag irises are quite good for that. They'll take up any free nutrients within that pond body. So that tends to suppress things like algal growths or sort of biofilms, or in cases things like duckweeds. But it can be a tough one. That yeah, it's a hard job. I should add actually as well with that, if you're adding flag irises, if it's a small pond, add them in an aquatic basket, because they will gladly see your pond as an opportunity to turn it into a bog. So just to monitor. Good question.
Yeah, and another good question here, which is, to what extent are introduced species expanding their ranges and out competing the native species, or are they just potential competitors and sources of disease very locally?
Good question. I think the fact we're in a position of being an island, so here in the UK, I mean, nothing necessarily that's introduced would be increasing its range throughout the UK if it wasn't introduced somewhere. When it comes to changing range, I mean, there is a chance, because we are starting to find even some of our native species are moving further north as it becomes milder. They're able to cope with that. That is occurring. And could you just repeat the second part of that for me?
Not sure I can. I've just moved. Oh yes. Or are they just potential competitors and sources of disease very locally?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I think it's going to be a question for many species group anyway over time, particularly with things that are able to move around, so less reliant on sort of walking around, so things that are flying. As things start to move up, you'll find people get very excited. For example, if a bird flies more north than it's ever been, everybody loves it, although actually maybe it shouldn't be here. Things like amphibians are interesting with that, because there is the possibility, should there be more space for some of these non-natives that were here and are doing quite well in a niche. That's a lovely discussion. I think I'd love to have sort of a broader thing. When it comes to disease, I think again it's going to depend on where the non-natives have come from. If they've just been released by someone who's collected them somewhere else and dumped them, then obviously I think you'd agree it's sort of an irresponsible way of having them there, and they may have disease and cause problems. Competition can be problematic. I mean, that was part of the issue that happened with the northern clade of pool frogs here in the UK, in that things like marsh frogs, particularly in the southeast, completely outcompeted them. They love the same kind of ponds. When they can interbreed, but they make sterile hybrids. When they die off, the larger one just exists. So you have less and less pool frogs. Then the edible frogs, which are the hybrid, dies off as well. Next thing you know, you've blinked and it's just marsh frogs. So it can be problematic, but it's a very good discussion point. That's certainly one of these things I sit around and sort of muse about.
Okay, interesting question here is, my pond has dried out the last few springs. Can the frog spawn survive in the damp mud? And maybe we could comment on ways of stopping it drying out as well, Emily.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think it depends on how damp it is. It's probably likely if it was in sort of damp mud, what's probably going to end up occurring is you'll likely lose the top half quite quickly, because there won't be enough water being moved around. So generally when frog spawn is laid, what's happening is there's basically this action within there, within the water itself, and it basically just sort of fan circulates water around all of the spawn. But I think if you're going to have the top half that exposed, it will probably die off. And the minute you have dead spawn, you have a problem, because the minute dead spawn exists, you start to then get, that's when you get sort of the creamy white looking frog spawn and things like that, as it starts to either break down or it gets fungal infections. So it probably won't do that well in sort of a damp bog, unless it's so damp that generally got a bit of a puddle. And to maybe combat that, I'm not sure if your sort of drying out pond is lined or anything. It may be removing silt from that place if it is lined, as a good indication, or potentially digging further down, so maybe removing the liner, going a bit deeper, relaying it to have a slightly deeper body of water. For us, we generally say a good rule of thumb is about 30 to 60 centimeters, and it should hold water throughout, sort of even through summer. It should be deep enough to cope with that. Yeah, the other thing I suppose you could do as a last minute, like this spring it might be too soon, maybe your frogs might be ready to go. By all means, you could have a bucket of sort of water, sort of non-tap water ideally, outside, that you can help rear that spawn all the way up, if that's sort of the last case scenario you have. Or if you have another pond slightly further down the garden, by all means move them down there. Although we say don't move spawn within reason, I would say a female frog would likely access water bodies within about sort of 500 meters from where you find her. So you won't be spreading a disease if you're only moving her like the spawn 2 meters further along. Whereas if you're going beyond that is when our intervention might be negative.
Okay, we've got a question about pond plants that are good for amphibians, but there's a link being added to the chat on that one, so we won't do that one now, Emily, since time's quite tight. But an urgent question is, can I clean out my pond now? Because the person says they've heard the best time is November, but is it too late?
Depends. If nothing's in there yet, so if you've got no amphibians at all within that space, by all means get in that pond, because I think if the pond is, if you know by looking at it that it's not at all in a good state for any amphibian to be able to successfully lay spawn or breeding it or other animals to use, it's going to be far more useful for you to get in there and clear it now. So I think still go for it. Only stop if you find that lots of things have already got in.
And what about white jelly clumps found in a field? What do you say about that? They're found during December, and is it unfertilized spawn, is the question?
Could be, yeah, very likely. So lots of our female, particularly frogs, she'll likely have most of her spawn for the year, the clumps inside of her already, by about sort of the end of November. So she'll generally go into sort of a brumation or hibernation with spawn already. So it's very possible it might be a predator or something has killed her, or even if she's had any kind of trauma, it may be she's released the spawn to move on. Is probably the most likely. You can get the other end of the spectrum. It has been known of a heron eating lots of female frogs or even frog spawn, and then as it flies over places, they regurgitate, and they'll throw it back up. But that's a bit more left field, I suppose. But yeah, good question and good observation.
And can you comment a little bit more about the newt frog dilemma? So there's a question about, have newts eaten all our frog tadpoles? So if they had, how do you know, I suppose?
Yeah.
And is that why we don't have frog spawn and frogs in that particular garden? And if someone was wanting frogs, how would you help them survive?
Yeah, no, good questions. It is possible that newts can come in and decimate a whole sort of frog population of spawn. Generally, a good sign of that will be if you've witnessed the frogs mating, laying the spawn, and then you're noticing that it's diminishing bit by bit. So when birds tend to eat spawn, they'll eat massive amounts of it at once. Newts will obviously start to pick from the bottom up. So that's very possible. That's what's happening. I mean, it's a tough one, this, because I get asked this in many different ways of whether or not it's people wanting to discourage newts, whereas actually each of them can use spaces together. What you could try, and it might not be, well, I think it's a popular opinion, because who wouldn't want more ponds in the garden? You could try alternative ponds within the garden itself. So that could certainly be a thing. With newts as well, they'll also eat lots of small invertebrates. So making sure that that pond is basically at the best quality it can be, so they have other stuff they may eat. But I don't want to say to you that that's the perfect or only answer, because if given an option, you probably would go for your easiest meal. So it may be that your frogs are moving elsewhere to do some of their sort of spawning. Like if a neighbour has a pond, they may be using that rather than yours. Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, obviously, I'd say I love them all equally. I mean, I love toads the most, but it is tough. Newts are very good at finding bodies of water quickly. So it just may be once they've boomed and someone else puts in a pond, they'll dissipate out and your frogs should return, and there should be a reasonable amount to go. But yeah.
Okay, this is final question, because we've just got 3 minutes left. So, do amphibians return to the pond where they originated from when they breed once they are adults?
Great question. Toads definitely do. So toads try their best to get back to their maternal ponds. They'll try their best to get back to those journeys, which is why things like wildlife tunnels are so important for them. They cross at the same point each year on these toad crossings to try and get back to that same place. They are the most rigid when it comes to, they're not very good at choosing other options. You can sometimes get through it from, if particularly female toads, if they hit a wall or a barrier they can't get through to get to their pond, when they're on the return journey, so when they're heading back now, deciding it's a failure, if they hit a pond on that route back to wherever they're hibernating, they can sometimes use that space. So if you have ponds on route that you know they go on, they may use them, but it is a bit tough. For newts, as long as the pond, well, basically newts are not always the most fussy, as long as there's appropriate sort of leaves for them to be able to lay eggs on. They generally will use anybody, and they're generally quite quick, particularly in urban areas, to find it. Frogs don't always make the best choices. I'm sure lots of us have seen frogs spawn on like driveways when your pond's like a few meters away, and they just haven't quite made it. In those scenarios, frogs will use whatever's available. The only thing they tend to avoid is they'll avoid ponds that have high populations of fish. The fish give off sort of an eDNA within the water that the amphibians can smell. That's also the case with newts, actually, that if they smell that, they'll tend to avoid that space. So yeah, don't worry about attracting frogs, and newts should be fine. If they're local and you put a pond in, they will get there. It might take them a season or two. They'll find it. Toads, slightly more rigid, but when they get to your garden, they'll eat all your pests. So that's the angle you go for with them, I think.
Thanks, Emily. Okay, one final thing to add in the things to do is that we've got a Toad Summit coming up, which is in February. So I've just been asked to mention that. So that's just if anyone interested in, and that's in the Sussex area. So anyone in that area, if they'd like to come along, they're very welcome. And Ashley's just added that to the link to the chat. Okay, over to you, Kathy, to round off.
Okay, well, just to say thank you very, very much, Emily, for an absolutely fantastic end to our webinar series. You certainly lifted my January blues, and I hope you have done for many other people, and can't wait for the spring to come. So I think it's been a lovely start to the new year and really, really interesting presentation, so thank you. And then just say thank you to everybody who attended, because you've been a great audience. Most of you have managed to stay all the way through, so that's a great accolade, and we look forward to hearing about all your sightings in the near coming spring. Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thank you.